Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. From 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us. Today is actually January 6, 2018. I'm doing a pre-recorded interview with a friend of our show, Shaun McGee, who has not been back in a while, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Shaun, for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to get some of the information out about the nuclear industry.
Yeah, and I want to thank you. By the way, I want to remind our listeners that Shaun is with nuclearnews.net. That's nuclear-news.net. So it's if you want to get real information about what's going on in the nuclear industry and verifiable, certified verifiable information, it's one of the few places we can go. And very clever reporting and comprehensive reporting, I might say. So, Shaun, before I ask you about the current news, why don't you bring us up to date on some of the things that went on last year that you were reporting on the radiation level all throughout Europe?
Yeah, well, it was around the world, actually. It was from China to the UK, basically, and beyond, probably America as well, although they wouldn't report these releases. Yeah, well, no, there is a bit of an update, actually, on that. I think we covered some of the issues in previous podcast interviews. And I would say that, we were sort of looking at the start of the year. We looked at the Norwegian thorium research reactor, which is basically funded by Russia, the US, and all the countries that have to do with nuclear, Korea and what have you. And this particular research reactor had a release in September 2016. But we didn't actually find out about it until many months later, in 2017, a report by Bologna. And so basically we were looking at that and we were sort of saying, why are they waiting 2 or 3 months to release this information? And I think we were talking about the fact that being able to trace where the radiation leaks come from, you need to know within a couple of weeks because the isotopes are washed away or they break down into other things that are untraceable. So anyway, we had that one, and we did talk about that. So maybe people could look at some of the earlier podcasts to get a more rounded insight into it. And we had another thing that happened. It was in March 2017, and there was another release. There was iodine over Europe, and it went viral on the internet. I think Bologna reported on it, and they even blamed nuclear-news.net for spreading the information around. And the information then went out to other people, and they were making other claims We were going generally by the reports and maybe some observations, but other people were taking it even further. And the videos that were basically made, some of them were getting, say, 20,000 hits and what have you. It was a real mess for the nuclear industry. But anyway, we highlighted the fact that there are radiation releases. The industry itself was saying, well, there's nothing to do, there's no health effects and there's hardly any radiation and all the rest of it. Now, the March 2017 one, we didn't know whether that came from Holden or from the medical nuclear reactor or one of the other research reactors in Hungary. But in either event, that was another incident that happened. Now, I think we had a fairly quiet summer, but in August, towards the end of the summer, we had a release of ruthenium-106. Now, this wasn't actually reported until about, I think it was October, November sometime. It was a few months. And once again, everybody was going, where is it from? And we did an article on that, and we were sort of trying to assess where it came from and what was going on, and we did a few articles actually. And the very last one I did, I think it was on December 12th, and I said ruthenium-106, why are they lying? And then I actually looked at another possible source, because they were saying it was either from Mayak in the far east of Russia near Kazakhstan, or it was from EDF, from Le Hague in France. But when I did a bit of research, I was looking at, where is ruthenium-106 found? Where are they using it? And I actually tracked two places or industrial units, scientific industrial units in Hungary, going back to Hungary again, the IEA's best friend for nuclear rubbish. And they were actually doing, over periods of years, they were doing studies on ruthenium-106, and they were trying to work out, how to process it and what have you. But there was, so in fact, actually, I then made the posit and I showed the screenshots. I showed articles from PDFs where the studies were being done on ruthenium-106 in Hungary. And then within 2 days, the Russians admitted that it was from Mayak, which was a bit interesting, because we at the end of the day, we make a claim that it's from Hungary, and they've spent months denying it was them and it was somebody else and all the rest of it. And then eventually, because I think it was because of my article on the 12th that they decided, oh, look, we don't want them looking into Hungary, because that's a very sensitive area for the nuclear industry, because they have a lot of pollution in that place, a lot of radioactive pollution. Really? So, obviously they all got together and made the decision that somebody was going to take the blame. Mayak took the blame, and it may be the case that Mayak was the source, but I'm just saying that the publicity, the PR value was that that Mayak had to take the blame. Otherwise, people would have been looking at Hungary as a possible source for those ruthenium-106 releases that were found in Europe. Now, so anyway, we had that one. That was quite interesting. And then in September 27, of course, we had the North Korea explosion, the nuclear explosion. And there was planes flying overhead and sniffer planes, trying to find radioactive to find out if is it hydrogen or is it a nuclear explosion or a hydrogen explosion and all the rest of it. And there was no reports made afterwards about this. The claims that it was a hydrogen explosion was because it was a little bit bigger. It was only a tiny bit bigger than the one before. And they were saying because it was a bit bigger, it must have been a hydrogen explosion. The only problem with that being is that they gave no isotopic evidence, which would have been, they would have got, if they're circling the borders of North Korea, they would have got a sniff of these particular isotopes. However, in China, a Chinese newspaper reported that there was iodine-129, which is quite a long-lasting isotope. This iodine-129 was found on its own, reported in China, and the Chinese report was saying, well, is it from Europe, is it from North Korea, or is it from Japan? Now, the North Korea, they were saying North Korea was unlikely because it was 2,000 kilometers, where it was measured was 2,000 kilometers away. But we know that doesn't make any issues. But the other issue is that if you have a hydrogen or an atomic explosion, you get different types of isotopes. You get a mixture of isotopes like you do from melted down reactors. Now, they only found one isotope, iodine-129. Now, iodine-129 could have come from a nuclear explosion, but they said that they doubted it was from there. So they were also saying, well, it could have come from Europe, which is quite interesting, along the jet stream straight across Russia or below and straight into China where it was picked up. Now, if that's the case, then that's interesting, but then we didn't find out where this iodine-129 comes from, and nobody's reported on it since. The Chinese reported on it, which is quite interesting because they also said, was it from nearby? So it's not Korea. If it wasn't Europe, then where did it come from? Was it nearby? And that could have been also from Mayak. It could have been from Japan. It could have been from China. So the bottom line was, though, they did report it, and the fact that they reported it probably meant it wasn't from China. It could have been from one of the other local nuclear states, or even as far away as Europe again. Our friend in Hungary, maybe they're producing iodine-129. It sounded like it was, because if it's a single isotope, it's some sort of experimental or medical isotope manufacturers that are making individual isotopes and releasing those isotopes if they don't need them, when they're using other isotopes that they've split off from the original sort of, I don't know, they call it menu of isotopes, and we had that from Hungary before with I think it was iodine-125, if I remember correctly, but it was another type of iodine, and that definitely did come from the Budapest medical isotope reactor, which is one of the main reactors for medical isotopes, and supplies a lot of Europe and what have you. So and it's very much protected by the IEA. So anyway, I think we kind of updated it. That was all the way up to December, when the last report was made by China on isotopic analysis of things that are in our air. And the main takeaway is that in every situation, the nuclear industry basically prevaricates, denies, and then eventually might admit, but with a caveat that there was no health effects. And of course, we know that where these isotopes are being made, there could well be health effects to the local population, and that was well documented by CRERAD. I'm not sure if Bologna mentioned that, but certainly CRERAD did. And indeed, while CRERAD's been really good at and honest about tracking these particular isotopes down as best as it can, it actually received, it was being defunded by the French government. It was set up after Chernobyl because of the abysmal tracking of radiation over Europe, and especially in France, who denied that they had any radiation from Chernobyl hit them. But they certainly did. And they did from Fukushima, and basically CRERAD reported that. But they've been defunded. Last year they were defunded, which is, they're having to raise money to make up for their losses, basically. So if anybody wants to donate to CRIIRAD, go to their webpage, and they have a donation button. So please donate. They're one of the very few independent nuclear testers. Okay, so I think that's where I've got to with the update on the radiation contamination of various areas around the planet.
Yeah, well, that and that's just the stuff we know about. Like I know here in the States, just a few days ago, Pilgrim was shut down manually. They had to shut it down during the snowstorm manually, and that's right. They put out this warning that said no harm to human health, but we know when they do these things that they are letting out massive amounts of radioactive nuclides. But that seems to be their whole MO. And this is the interesting thing it's like it's an intent. This is sort of a standard industry thing that unless people are going to die immediately from it, it's not harmful.
Just to follow that up, actually, when you get those releases, you get a large spike. It may go on for an hour or a couple of hours or maybe longer, but generally it's quite short-lived, and you might get a series of spikes as they release it. Depends on how much there is, maybe over a day or two. And in Germany, they actually advise people around reactors when they're doing refueling and what have you, to maybe go on holiday. They actually say, we're going to do a release. So if you want to go and visit your friends in south of Germany, now's a good time, or north of Germany or whatever. Now's a good time. But they actually do allow the people in those local areas where there's likely to be a big spike of iodine or radon or whatever, that they give them the option to actually go out, or alternatively to stay in, close their windows at night, and obviously open up during the day to let the any radiation that's inside the house out. So when we're looking at that, the fact is, with Pilgrim, for instance, you'd have had a big spike. Now, there was a really interesting story done, and it wasn't to do with radiation, it had to do with climate change. And there was some climate monitoring going on. I think it was in Alaska. And what they found is that they were wondering why there was no snow and ice like there should be in Alaska, but the actual temperature gauges were basically showing sort of a quite a normal sort of amount of what do you call it, a normal amount of temperature for that time of year, but there was no snow. And when they looked into it, they realized that the little spikes, which would have been the hot air, where you get a short blast of hot air, but on a fairly regular basis, which would have melted the ice, was actually being deleted off the computer software. So, and this is exactly what happens with the radiation.
Repeat that again. What did you say? It was actually say that again.
Well, what happens is, if you imagine you've got a graph and it's on a straight line, and basically it's saying the temperature is, I don't know, 30 degrees centigrade, 20 degrees centigrade or something. So basically it's got that steady amount. But if there was like little hotspots where it jumped up to 40 degrees C, what would happen is, and it was for a short period of time, a spike, as we like to call it in these monitoring terms, the spike basically would be deleted by the software. So they were not aware of the average 20 degrees actually being higher. Wow. And it raised it enough to, on the average, to melt the ice. Right? So the bottom line was, and then what they had to do was work out, because they didn't realize that these spikes were being knocked off. Now, in radiation terms, the exact same things happens in the American, the European radiation monitoring setup. The IAEA removes the spikes. They say, because that was a bit of norm, that was some radon that just passed by the monitor, so that or the monitor wasn't working correctly. So they quite often, but not always, but they quite often knock off these spikes, and that means that the average dose, if you want to call it that, is much lower than it actually is. And of course,
that's what Matt Holstruck shows.
From our perspective, we would be looking at the health effects from radiation being just that little bit more than they reckon. And in the case of Alaska, where they were doing the temperature readings, it would show that the temperature was lower than it otherwise should be. So the bottom line was, though, it's quite an interesting little thing. I thought I'd mention that because, at the end of the day, it's quite relevant, to scientific testing and monitoring of anything, where they remove spikes which skew the average, which lower the average down.
Isn't that kind of just their total MO in the nuclear testing anyways? I mean, I think it was Christopher Busby that I heard on an interview talking about the Hiroshima studies, where they took out the control group or something. They actually messed with the original study.
That's an epidemiological trick that's used by the nuclear industry as one of many that they can utilize to try and get the average down. It's kind of like removing the spikes, if you like, and leave kind of average, And I did an article on polydactyl, which is where you have an extra finger or toe. And after Chernobyl, they found that, instead of like 1 or 2 people per year born with polydactyl, I mean, people are born with it, that there was actually up to 50.
Wow.
And when I was looking at, I was working with a colleague, a Japanese colleague, we found out that there was, I think it was 2 years after the Fukushima disaster, there was 100 babies with polydactyl in the Fukushima Medical Hospital.
Wow.
Right? And that meant 50 a year, so on average, so 50 a year. Now, the interesting thing there is that if you went to the Western version of the study of polydactyl in Chernobyl, what they did is that they extended the period up to 15 years, okay, of measurement for polydactyl, right? And and they probably had other little epidemiological tricks they used as well. But when you looked at the Russian study, which was done over 10 years, you found that to start off with, you had 50 a year. But then, by the 4th or 5th year, it was down to 20. And then by the 10th year, you're kind of back to, it might be 5 or 6. So it wasn't hugely more than you would have otherwise found. But what the Western guys did, they added another 5 years on. So they stuck another 50% of time on this particular study and dropped it down even further. Plus, they may not have actually taken into account the full counts that the Russians did. And so when they looked at it, they said, oh, no, there's only a slight increase in polydactyl, but, within normal tolerances. But the thing is that the Western study only relied on statistics, not their numbers. They didn't give you the numbers on the paper. But if you went to the Russian paper, they counted the numbers and created the statistics from the numbers. So it was a difference between being statistical analysis and what they call empirical analysis, which is what you see on the ground. All right. So if in Fukushima, we see they control the empirical evidence by making it illegal or hiding it or whatever. And we see that empirical evidence isn't used, but from day one, they were using statistical evidence to prove that there would be no health effects. With the first UNSCEAR report, for instance, was saying, oh, there won't be any health effects because, here's the statistics. So at the end of the day, when we were looking at it, the manipulation of epidemiology is a big thing for the nuclear industry. And I have to say, if you're looking at, the cancer rate from genetically modified pesticides or anything at all, the same tricks and the same kind of manipulation that are used. True.
It's the same exact thing, and in fact, it's almost like an intentional thing, so that we can't blame one type of contaminant over another. I mean, I was reading a story about the what do they call the forever chemicals that have been dumped in the United States. There was an article in the New York Times I read about. It was this is what I find in the States. Information about highly sensitive information comes to us through the op-ed. They don't allow reporters to report on it, but you can often find gems on the op-ed, on the opinion pages of these, the mainstream media here. Because people will make opinions about this, like this article was about the forever chemicals that need to be banned forever. They basically last forever, much like they didn't make the comparison to radioactivity, but they are very much similar to them, and they last a very long time. The same types of diseases, and they were unleashed on the American population in the 40s at exact the same time when they unleashed the nuclear monster. So
we've got the oil industry with their plastic industry that's behind, that's in front of them.
And it's all the same, exactly. So, well, Shaun, we have about 35 minutes left, and I really want to be able to get to this article that you posted this morning on nuclearnews.net about... the title is very interesting. Fukushima radiation case doesn't belong in U.S. Any conflicts of interest here? Do you want to talk about what you sort of discovered? You did some research, and thank you for that.
Okay. Well, it's what it was. I was looking at the case itself, and there's been lots of toing and froing with this Ronald Reagan case, the USS Ronald Reagan case. There's a lot of people that have put their names forward with various health effects, and I'm sure some of those people just happen to develop health effects. Our environment is generally very unhealthy and what have you. But they were quite young people.
You mean the people from the USS Reagan?
Yeah, the service personnel.
I don't think so. I think they were all affected. I'm just going to tell you that straight out. I don't think you can be near a nuclear radioactive massive meltdown like that, be thrown out and being told that you're going to, be put right into it and not be affected. I'm not going to give the nuclear industry any cover. You might want to, but I won't. But
no, I'll be talking in the case of the actual court case, where they'll probably be saying, well, look, these particular things are very likely to be connected to radiation. These ones may not be, and they would weigh it up, and it would be a case that the ones that you could definitely prove were connected to the nuclear, or that you could at least give some evidence that was connected to the radiation incident, then basically, you could, those people be the ones that you would push into the court case, But the bottom line is, I don't know what the numbers and the figures were, but we certainly know that with the amount of people from, who were young and healthy and within a very short space of time had lots of different health effects, that some of those health effects may well have been caused by what their sort of exposure to the big plume that came from, because everybody was saying, Japan got off lightly, which it pretty didn't, but certainly most of the radiation went out to sea. And certainly the USS Reagan was right in front of those plumes, So the bottom line is, though, is that we knew they got hit quite heavily, and we know that there's been too many health effects within sort of the population of that ship to sort of just be coincidence. And that is a fact that we can say. But anyway, it was going on, and I sort of realised that I put up an article, I think, a few days ago, and it was, the court case will be on Friday. So on Friday, the 5th of January, we had the court case, and then there was a report from Law 360 and another one from, Court News, I believe. And we put up articles about those. And I was just sort of kind of wondering, because Judge Janice L. Sammartino basically turned around, and she was the person that was in charge of that court case. And I was wondering, well, okay, so what they've said is that they're not wanting to have this particular court case held in the US, even though the USS Ronald Reagan is actually American soil, if you like. It's part of the American soil. Well, even though it was just off the coast of Japan. I mean, America has a lot of sort of US bases around Japan as well. So, but what they've decided is that they've rejected the sort of posit that they should have that court case held in the US, because GE is an American company and they have an office in TEPCO have an office in the US, and all the victims are in the US, and it was the actual thing that happened on US soil, if you like, which was the USS Ronald Reagan. So I was thinking, well, why would they send it over to Japan? Because we know in the court cases in Japan, it's very much biased towards industry, I would say, especially in recent years. So anyway, we were looking at what her sort of format was, and I found out, I didn't put this in the article, but I found out she was nominated by George Walker Bush, which is always an interesting point. But anyway, so and that was I think it was around about 2008 or 10, something like that. 2008, I think it was. And I could find financial disclosures for her in 2008, 2009, 2010, but nothing since. So they may be out there. Yeah, so they may be out there, but I haven't been able to find any financial disclosure reports for her. And but I looked at the 2010 one, the last one that was there, And I thought, right, well, she's invested in various companies, and there was Mytac, Fiserv, Tiva, and then the rest were really sort of there was about 5 other ones which were to do with insurance, investment, and what have you. So when I looked at Mytac, Fiserv, and Tiva, I thought, well, have they got anything to do with the nuclear industry or whatever, you know? So I found out that Mytac, in fact, were they did have a connection because they were doing. They've got 40 companies operating in 100 countries globally. It's a massive company, a good investment, I should suspect. But I found a report from April 3rd, 2014. That showed that Mytac Industries had acquired Ellis & Watt Global Industries, and that was a designer and fabricator of HVAC products for nuclear and military customers. So immediately I thought, so she's got her investments in that. Now it may be a case that she doesn't look into what her investments are all about, and this 2010 sort of report, you know, the last report she did, she may have sold all those details before the acquiring of Ellis & Watt Global Industries. But I just thought I'd put that there and just let people know. And I didn't look too much deeper. I was more interested in just getting a sort of an overview and allowing people to see this information and dig a bit deeper if they wanted to. So the second one I looked at was Fiserv, which is an investment company. And I looked at one of the a guy called Jim Jordan, who was employed by Fiserv, and he was the chief privacy leader for GE, General Electric, and you know, at the end of the day, there was all these nice little points, you know, and he was employed, I think it was 2005. In 1999 he was working for GE, and in 2005 he was employed by somebody called Atlanta's Check Free, and he was and of course they were basically part of Fiserv, so it was you know, there was that connection there. So one of their top dudes, basically, he was basically a, you know, ex-GE employee, you know. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So is there anything else out there, I thought. And I had a look at Tiva. Now, Tiva are an Israeli company, pharmaceutical industries, and they actually make resin for nuclear waste containers, I believe it is. You know, I was thinking of whips at the time. I wonder if they were the ones that did the sealant on whips, you know, which failed. But I don't think they were. But anyway, but they do make some sort of resin for waste containers. Now, they were having difficulties, financial difficulties, by November the 5th, 2017, and a billionaire businessman, Len Blavatnik, was looking to buy a significant stake in the debt-ridden Israeli drug maker. So I didn't look into Tiva too far. I don't know if they were doing isotope medical pharmaceuticals as well. But, you know, I thought it was quite interesting with this billionaire businessman who's linked as a Ukrainian businessman. But he was involved in Russia. And he was actually, a Guardian article actually was sort of saying that he was like a Putin apologist, you know, like we hear all over the news at the moment. And I just thought that was quite interesting. So he was, you know, this is some of the background, but this is all up to date stuff. So we don't, you know, this isn't necessarily completely relevant to the judge herself, but you know, if she's still got those investments, though, that might have been a little bit of an issue for her taking the court case, you know, because there's, you know, you've got these dodgy companies, and
well, she was assigned in 2012 for sure, and in 2012 she still has Tiva, Fiserv, Mytac. She still is part.
We don't know that because the last report was in 2010. Interestingly,
No. I just found a report on Judicial Watch. I kind of am a legal beagle here, and so you can go to Judicial Watch. I think that's the name of this website. Yeah, it's judicialwatch.org, and I was able to dig in and find one that was submitted on 5/14/13, just now, just as you were talking. because I was like, I wonder if she's still involved.
Send me the link and I'll update that. But obviously that's 2012, so we're at 2018 at the moment. But
well, so this was 2000. Well, she's been assigned to this case since this was submitted 5/14/13. She's been engaged in this case for a long time. Yeah.
So we knew that in just before the case, she got the case, that she still had the was it all three? Was it while we're live?
You know what the fact is? It's probably, this is just standard par for the course. They put on people who they know on the bench, who they know are going to side with the nuclear industry. This is why nobody ever wins against the nuclear industry.
Well, it's very interesting, I have to say, when I was digging into it. But you can send me that report. What I'll do is I'll add that to it. I'll say I found the 2012 report, and I'll credit you as well. But yeah, so it's quite interesting that we did find, and of course with her insurer, obviously you'd expect insurance and banking sort of interests or whatever.
Wow.
And there's 4 of those, I should say. So basically, it's that they are. I mean, I think it was after 2011, the Fukushima disaster. Quite a lot of these investment companies and insurance companies, quietly withdrew their money from the nuclear industry. And in the UK, they took out, I think, 350 billion. The big 5 insurance companies in the UK. And they then that hole that was in the nuclear industry, was actually covered by the UK taxpayer. And then, actually, just to rub salt into the wounds, they took the 350 billion that they'd pulled out before their investment tanked, and they invested that in infrastructure, which would make them lots of money from the taxpayer. So they got kind of double bubble taxpayer money, first to bail them out of the nuclear industry, and then to give them interest on the same money that they were investing into infrastructure in the UK, schools, roads, and what have you. So the UK, the poor UK taxpayer, got double whammy for the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So I just thought I'd mention that, and it might also explain why the UK is so hot on protecting the actual nuclear industry, because they've also got other people that they're invested in, that have investments in, and some of them can't get their money out as easy. Some if they take their money out, they're just going to lose. After Fukushima, there was a Norwegian company, one of the sovereign wealth funds, I believe, had invested in TEPCO, and they actually pulled their money out. I think it was in 2012. But they did it at a loss because they could see the writing on the wall for the nuclear industry. So they actually pulled out what money there was left. And I think there wasn't much at all, actually. But they wrote off their loss, which did TEPCO a favour, obviously, because and the Japanese government, because they didn't have to pay any reimbursement to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So, but yeah, so that's quite interesting.
I just think it's just beyond outrageous that we are dealing with an industry that is harming. I mean, what was I did not follow up on this. I haven't had a chance to read the outcome, but what was her reasoning behind saying that this case could be held in Japan, where they obviously are quite prejudiced against the soldiers?
Well, I think. Well, I mean, I've got the article on the Nuclear News. If people want to read up the whole article, or as much information as we have at the moment about it. But they were saying that I think it was GE attorney Michael Shizzle said that the case belongs in Japan, where the facts originated and the witnesses are. Okay, so. Sishel said that the Japanese government declared the nuclear meltdown was not a natural disaster, so TEPCO could be held liable for the damages. So, obviously there was a bit of to-ing and fro-ing about this, but it's I think what was her final? I I mean,
well, I'm reading an article that's quoted her saying that the soldiers have provided no information to support an assertion that TEPCO knew its actions would cause harm likely to be suffered in California. How could she make that statement?
Well, because thanks to the UK, the US, and Japan, they've worked together to say that you can have up to 100 millisieverts a year. It's supposed to be 1 millisievert a year, but they're saying you can have up to 100 millisieverts a year with no health effects, which is actually ridiculous because we see health effects at 5 millisieverts a year in Chernobyl. So, at the end of the day, it's very much a case that, and that's we're talking dose there. We're not talking about particles that you inhale, eat, or breathe. Breathe, eat, or swallow, or take in as internal particles, damaging the sensitive bits inside your body. So I suppose really from that point of view, they would, that's probably why they were pushing the 100 millisievert and under. And in September 2011, the UK went to the Fukushima Symposium, and where the Japanese were trying to get specialists to come in and do reports on the accident in terms of health effects and what have you. We had all the usual UK players who went there, and they were vying for funding from the Japanese government to get these things. And at that point, they were one of them, Richard Wakeford, from he was originally from BNFL, but now he's with Manchester University. He basically said that there's no health effects for under 100 millisieverts, and although we don't have any, I think in that meeting he said that although we don't have any. It was all televised. I've got video copies. It's been taken down since. He turned round and said that there's obviously issues with internal particles getting in, but he was going to do some statistics to work out the health effects of that. So, and I have no doubt that he's come up with some statistics to prove that as well, although it hasn't been widely circulated. So at the end of the day, they really don't take into account these sort of nanoparticles, for instance, that can get past the brain barrier from the blood. They can move around the body very easily. There was a report that was being delayed in the UK that proves that is the case. But it was being delayed in the UK for years. I think in 2012 it had been 5 years. Because at the end of the day, they would have to take air pollution much more seriously if these nanoparticles that could get into, through the skin or, through masks and things, into the blood, into the brain. So basically these, and they're not just radiation particles, but all sorts of nanoparticles, and they would cause various problems. So, that was the sort of the cover up there. Now, of course, if you were on the USS Ronald Reagan, you sucked in not just bigger particles, but you also would have sucked in a lot of these nanoparticles. So there could be a wide range of health effects from that. But anyway, it's just one of the problems with the nuclear industry is that they might say, oh yeah, well we'll put a figure for the damage to particle damage, but then they're not actually looking at the full science, the updated science that says, well, nanoparticles have a much bigger health effect. So where do you go with that?
What the attorney, the co-attorney from the TEPCO, from the Reagan case, from Bonner, let me see, what's the name of the company? My tongue is tied. Bonner and Bonner of Sausalito, their co-counsel, Mr. Edwards, has said that they're going to refile because this class action lawsuit has been dismissed, but they are going to refile and reconsider because basically what she's done is dismiss their class action lawsuit, send it to Japan where General Electric can actually be dismissed as a defendant in Japan.
Right, yeah.
So, this is really just picking apart the case little by little by little. I mean, it is just such an outrage, and I'm glad that you actually were able to pick up on this idea that this woman has a vested interest in these corporations that support the nuclear industry, because for her to say that she is not prejudicial, I mean, maybe this will help turn the tide in a future case where they can, show that she has a vested interest. She did not divest herself of these things. I mean, at least in 2014, she wasn't divested of them when she was assigned the case. She's been on this case a super long time. And this is just such an outrage. I don't know, as an American, I feel completely outraged that this judge has just denied this case and said that it doesn't belong in the United States.
And in fairness to the judge, when we're talking about Edward Snowden and spying and the Pentagon's power and, the military industrial complex in the USA, that there would be a huge pressure on her. In her defense, there would be a huge pressure on her to drop the case or have it go a certain way. And it may not even be a case. I mean, it may be a case that she's not aware of any nuclear connected things with her investments. Maybe somebody else is sorting that out for her. But certainly we, in the UK, we found that some judges are put highly under pressure. I mean, the British nuclear veterans test case that Chris Busby was part of, he arranged 4 specialists from various parts of the world, from Japan and various other places, Germany and what have you, to come into the court case and say, yes, radiation has health effects. And basically the judge there said, look, I'm not going to take your evidence. I'm going with the scientific evidence of the government or the MOD's specialist, which is a completely biased way of looking at it. But that there's all these different sort of pressures. So that judge, he was supposed to take 6 weeks. So he finished, I think it was September. So by mid-October, we should have got the results from that. But he waited another 6 weeks until it was Christmas, and we on Christmas Eve, I think it was, they released the with no publicity, by the way, they released the findings of the judge where he said, oh, well, I'm going with the government on this one. And he went with the government because he basically completely ignored all the scientific evidence to the contrary. Anyway, there's more stuff going to be coming up about the British nuclear test veterans case, and Chris is still fighting the good fight, and there are some angles, but
we'll the sad part. It's so sad that we have to have people fighting in court. I mean, I just find it like here we have on the British side and we have here in the American side obvious cases of exposure where we actually have Americans and you have British attorneys, I'm sure. Like here, we have this American attorney. His name is Gregory Stone, the TEPCO attorney, Gregory Stone, with Munger, Tolles, and Olson in Los Angeles, a Los Angeles-based legal firm, defending TEPCO. General Electric attorney Michael Sischer, S-C-H-I-S-S-E-L, Sischel, of Arnold and Porter in New York. 2 big, high-powered cases. They're not. I just find this like revolting that we have these American attorneys defending a company that put 420 of our own soldiers at risk, and they are all actually very sick, and many of them have already died. Several of them are already died, and so typical to the nuclear industry is they're just going to wait for these people to die. That's the sad part. They'll just wait for people to die. And yet,
considering Mr. he actually countered Bono was simply wrong in the fact that Compensation Act has not been applied to their own citizens, only businesses. Now, he turned around and said, Bono was simply wrong in claiming Japanese Nuclear Damage Compensation Act had not benefited individual Japanese citizens.
Oh my
he
God.
He said it is the conduct of defendants TEPCO and GE, which occurred in Japan, not the plaintiff's place of residence, that should determine jurisdiction. But the bottom line was, though, when he's saying that the issue about compensation to the victims, he's totally ignoring the fact that some victims are being forced to move back to contaminated areas. Other ones have their sort of costs for having to move out of the contaminated areas were stopped, I think, sometime last year, at the end of last year. And also that compensation that is offered is so low that it just doesn't cover all the losses that were incurred by all the individuals, with their farms and their businesses and everything else. They actually got just a kind of a small amount, and many people haven't, are still waiting. And in fact, there's court cases in Japan that are of victims who are trying to get compensation. So when you read the paragraph that was in the court document, then basically you're not seeing the bigger overall picture of why Bonner would say, well, there is an issue with the compensation in Japan and how it's worked out. So there's lots of shenanigans going on to minimize the payments.
Well, not only that, look what it's done to Japanese culture. They passed a law so people can't even talk about what's going on in Fukushima. I mean
that was also partially to do with the Five Eyes, the surveillance network, and they basically turned around and said, look, the Five Eyes, where in order for Japan to be a second tier operator of the Five Eyes, which means they get limited access to the Five Eyes computer surveillance network, certainly enough to spy on the Japanese citizens, and activists, that they would basically be, and this was reported by Edward Snowden, by the way, last year. So basically, when we're looking at that, part of that issue with the Japanese secrets law occurred because of American pressure, because they wanted to, because the Japanese wanted access to this amazing surveillance network the NSA have and GCHQ have. So we knew that. So
you're saying that the secrecy law about Fukushima was in part passed. The primary reason that Fukushima is not allowed to be discussed is because they wanted to be able to surveil their own populace?
Well, not so much that. I think it's that they wanted to surveil their own populace, and that would be very useful if you wanted to try and stop people from coming out with bad information, like whistleblowers, for instance. And, we've had a lot of whistleblower information coming out from Japan. We've been very lucky. It was much better than it was after Chernobyl. Japan is a more open society. But they wanted to make it a less open society like Belarus or Ukraine, because, then they have much better control over. And it's not just nuclear incidents. Japan has a lot of, environmentally unfriendly practices. So, and obviously dodgy goings on. So,
yeah. At least in the United States, not a single whistleblower case has had the perpetrators pay their dues. Right? Or
no.
have had the issue corrected. Like, these people have their sense of ethics, like, I'm outraged. I'm working for this organization, and I'm going to out this, and I'm going to put my life on the line. I'm going to go to jail, and I'm going to do what I need to do. Okay, that's all well and good, but when you go through that whole process, at the end of the line, nothing changes. The person who outs the crime gets persecuted, but they're still... It's like the nuclear industry. How many whistleblowers have we had who have had their cars destroyed, who have had their lives destroyed? I mean, who...
Yeah, myself, I was targeted in the UK because of, the information I was digging out, not necessarily whistleblowing, but just journalism, But if people are wondering, is it okay to stop these nasty whistleblowers, just bear in mind that the tobacco companies had managed to manipulate the data, the statistics, if you like, to prove that there was no health effect from cigarette smoking. And the only reason, after 20 years of all these studies that were done and counter studies and everything else, and the only reason that we actually really know that tobacco causes cancer is basically because somebody in the tobacco industry picked up all the files that were done, the internal files of the tobacco industry, and walked out with them and gave them over. And then after that, there was billions upon billions of dollars in lawsuits against the tobacco companies for causing people's cancers. And that happened in the 90s, wasn't it? And so, whistleblowers are intrinsic to our democracy. They're the balance against the corporate greed. Corporate sort of malfeasance. And if we don't allow them to have a say. And if we don't, have those court cases where people are basically taken into account of what they have done, like the tobacco industry, then at the end of the day, we're going to end up in a very, very sort of sad world of polluted, high cancer toll, the whole lot. And we could obviously talk about high cancer tolls at the moment, but maybe in a later interview. But let's bear in mind that people that do whistleblowing basically are actually and we know that, say, for instance, who is it? Who's your American Fairwinds? Yeah. So when we look at Fairwinds, they were basically
Arnie
kicked
Gunderson.
out.
You mean Arnie Gunderson?
They were basically kicked out of the house, chased around, spied on. I've known other people in America who've had similar issues with being spied on and harassed. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, we know that's going on. But in the case of nuclear, unlike tobacco, we haven't had our moment of justice yet. Obviously we've talked about why that might be in this particular podcast.
Yeah, this is a big issue, and I guess this is why people don't go after it. This is why people just sort of rather just move on and ignore it, because the forces behind this level of pollution are so gigantic that it feels like a tide we can't push back against. I think we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice but to stand up against it. Because we're talking about, even if the world is going to end in 50 years, I really want to stop my grandchildren from having a horrendous life if possible.
Yeah, same here.
It's just outrageous. Well, Shaun, thank you for joining us. I encourage everybody to go to nuclear-news.net, dig around on that website. I interviewed Christina McPherson a few weeks ago. The interview came out. She's an awesome, delightful human being. I've interviewed Hervé, and Shaun, these three people put together this website that is really vital to most of us in this, that are paying attention to this. And you don't have to agree with their views, but guess what? They give you really verifiable, certifiable information that you can follow up on your own links. So you don't have to believe their own summation, right? So
I totally. And I would point out very quickly that Google, over the past 2 years, has been giving us a bit of grief, but since around about June, the amount of hits we get from Google has reduced. And I've also noticed when I'm searching nuclear-news.net with its hundreds of thousands of posts about nuclear issues, is that we turn around and we can't find all the links connected with certain keywords. So it's nearly impossible to thoroughly search nuclear-news.net using the internal or using Google in any way, shape or form to try and actually find articles that we've got. There's certain articles I can't, I know the headlines if I type them all the keywords in and nothing comes up. There's other ones where I know there's maybe a few hundred articles about that particular subject, but we get maybe 5, 10 or 20 articles. So there is definitely something going on with that. But, the only way to really keep up with it is to, give us a visit a couple of times a week, quickly trawl through the articles we do. Give yourself like 20 minutes, half an hour if that's your interest. And then basically you'll get a good update on what's happening in the nuclear industry. We have a certain bias as anti-nuclear activists, but certainly we're not necessarily turning around and just having a completely biased sort of view on it. We do appreciate that there's some good things happen with the nuclear industry, and we do give them some credit for that. But,
well, that's more than I do. But you know what, Shaun? We have to jump in. We're at the end of our hour, so I actually give them no credit. I think we have to have nothing nukes. So that's my position. I'm a hardliner on this one. So
unfortunately, there is more bad than good. I have to admit that.
Well, put your courage feet on, guys, and we really appreciate you joining us. And we will talk with you soon. Take care.